Hi there. Hello, everyone. It is my first ElixirConf. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about working with the Common Locale Data Repository in Elixir, or the CLDR. It's quite a long-winded name. I did not choose it. It was chosen by a committee, probably. But it is what it is, and that's what we're working with. Why I'm excited about this topic specifically is it's a bit dense to get into. I've been working with it now for a couple of years, and it took me a while to wrap my head around it. I kind of banged into a lot of stuff, or got tripped up by a lot of things that I realized wasn't necessarily necessary. So I tried to condense my learnings as much as possible, and that's what this talk is about. So hopefully you can get a bit more of a context of what's possible with these libraries. It's quite powerful what you can do with them. And hopefully you can see how you can go further than just translating an application or formatting a number or something like that. You can actually rely on the logic of the underlying libraries to simplify your application logic quite a bit in certain key areas. So I'll highlight that as we go on during this talk. The end goal is something like this, where you build an interface, you build it once, and for a user who comes to it from the USA, it looks like something that should come from the USA, but for a user who comes from India or Indonesia, it looks like something that's built for them seamlessly. And it's one backend, it's one set of application logic. You're not peppering it with if statements or cases or something like that. You code it once and it works. That's what we're aiming at, and that's certainly possible. It's not necessarily easy always. So just a quick ask from the people who are here, how many of you have used CLDR libraries? There's a few. How many have used gettext for translating an application? Like everyone. So if you create a new Phoenix app, it comes with gettext baked in, and we all use that for translation. And it gets you about 80% of the way, but it's not the whole picture. So what I'm talking about is going that extra mile for really getting the UX you want for a polished experience, for a proper consumer-facing application. And why would you want to do that? Well, because there's a lot of potential. There's a big market out there, outside just English. In the US, Mexico, and Canada, English is definitely dominant, and starting with English makes absolute sense. So that's why it's not necessarily a very popular topic in the US. But as soon as you have something that works and you want to grow it to other markets, there are lots of interesting places where English is not the dominant language, and maybe not even close. So here in the US, yes, English is huge. What I found interesting looking through this data in the CLDR was how small the French-speaking population is. I know there's a French-speaking region in Canada. I just never realized it was quite that small. If you go to Latin America, Spanish is clearly dominant, but also look at how big the Portuguese population is. And what's interesting there is that's mostly just in one homogeneous market. It's mostly just Brazil. So if you target that with a software application, you've got a big addressable market right there. That's not that difficult to get to. If you wanted to go to the Indian subcontinent, maybe, here you can see that English is not dominant. Hindi is. But also, what's interesting about this kind of numbers is seeing how long that tail is. How many languages there are that have a very, very big population of people speaking them. And these are things that, like, I've never heard of them before actually digging through this. Now, if you do dig through this, what you find is that something like Hindi is dominant because it's like the default language in India. But then if you go region by region, mostly there's a regional language that's dominant in a specific city. So if you were to target India with a rollout for some local service, maybe it's grocery delivery or some two-sided marketplace or something like that, and you wanted to go city by city, you could learn from a data set like this which cities to target with the biggest populations, and then which language to optimize for in that specific region as you roll out one by one. So that's a very big number. This is for Southeast Asia, where Indonesian is very big, for example, but also a lot of other interesting smaller languages. This is Sub-Saharan Africa, where I'm from. I'm from Cape Town. Here, English gets you most of the way, but interesting enough, see how many French-speaking people there still are in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's about 9 times as many as there are in Canada. not in France, but in Canada. And then again, you have lots of these interesting regional languages, like Hausa. There is a Nigerian language that's spoken across that region of West Africa between Ghana and Togo and Chad and so on. Amharic and Oromo are two Ethiopian languages. And then again, Yoruba and Igbo are Nigerian languages in specific regions of Nigeria. So depending on where you want to go first, those things might be very interesting. So who's this talk for? It's for you if you are working at a very big corporate and you already have a global user base and you need to improve your UX in certain areas to maybe get better retention or get better metrics. It is also for you if you're at an established startup and again you've got millions of users, but you're trying to get more out of them, maybe get more of them through your funnel or increase your retention or something like that. You want to have a better UX for them. It's also for you if you are a startup and you are looking to grow, and you are going to have to grow out of the market that you are in. Maybe you started in English, or you're a French guy starting in France, and you know that you're going to reach the ceiling in your market, and you're going to need to grow further than that. Well, then this suite of libraries is actually fantastically useful. So it's not something that every developer needs. It's not something I suggest spending a lot of time on if you're just building your MVP. But if you want to go for the next step, then this kind of thing really pays off. And when it comes to localizing or internationalizing and then localizing an interface like this, I really have come to think of it in terms of three things that you're doing. The one is just static content that you're translating, and that's what gettext is for, and it's fantastic at that. So here we see some static content, for example, all the labels on buttons, for example, or your headings, section headings and things like that. If you have a homepage, most of your homepage will just be static content that can be translated once with gettext, and that's fine. You don't need CLDR for that. The next step, though, is variables. Now, on this thing here, I just want to highlight one variable, and that's the price. They are handled slightly differently because they're formatted differently in different places, and gettext can't really do that for you very well. Because the value in there is going to change each time for each product. You can't ask gettext, how should this be displayed in India, but also in Brazil, but also in France, for example, because the value is going to be different each time. So the variables, you only know their value at runtime, and that's when you need to figure out how to format them properly. Gettext can translate everything at compile time, and that's really the difference. And then thirdly, there are database records. So this is a product that was pulled from a database, so that all of that data, like the title and the description and so on, is only available to you as the data is coming from the database. So really, the translations should be coming from the database as well. You can't really handle that in the same workflow that you would the static content that you're doing with gettext. So it's really these three things, and if you do all three of them, then your whole app is 100% internationalized, and that's pretty powerful. So step one is the static text, and that's all of these things, and that's what gettext is going to do for you, and it works well for that. The gettext workflow is you annotate all of these strings wherever they are in your code base, you extract them, it creates a file, a translation template that you can then send off to have translated. The translations come back, you compile it into your code base at compile time, and then at runtime, based on the locale for the particular user, the right translations are picked. So there's a lot of compile time work in order to make the runtime really fast. The second step is variables, and that's where CLDR comes in. Now here it's just a price, and it's relatively simple, but these could be any kind of numbers, they could be dates, it could be units of measure, so feet or areas or volumes or anything like that. And once you start looking for them, you find them peppered all across your interface. So the bulk of the content is still gettext, yes, but you do find these kind of things pop up in the strangest places. And for this, you use CLDR, or the Common Locale Data Repository. And then step 3 is database records. So here it would be the title and the description. And for that, there's a package called XCLDR trans, based on an older package just called trans, that will let you translate these records on the database itself in a JSON field, but a structured JSON field, so that you can also query that JSON field efficiently. And that's fantastically useful. So how does it all work? So step one, gettext, I've already explained that it's very much a runtime versus compile time trade-off. And there's this fantastic talk by Andrea Leopardi, who wrote the package, who really explained the whole reasoning behind it, about the reasoning behind the architecture. And what's happening behind the scenes, basically, is just at compile time, you have this gettext backend module that's defined in your application, and using Elixir macros, where did that go? Using Elixir macros at compile time, it's compiling a bunch of functions into your code. Let me plug this out and back in, see if that works. So at compile time, you just get a whole bunch of functions being compiled into your code, so that at runtime, the translation is literally just a function call with two parameters. The one would be the user's locale, and the other one would be the string being translated. And that lookup would just be fantastically performant. So the people accessing a translated app or a localized app don't have to pay any performance penalty for doing so. Now, CLDR works slightly differently, but the way it works is really driven by the same kind of trade-offs. It's this compile time versus runtime thing. To understand how it works and why it works that way, let's first just quickly see where it comes from. So the CLDR is this big repo, and I said it was named by a committee because it's maintained by the Unicode Consortium. So the same people who bring you emojis, they also bring you this type of stuff. It's a massive data dump that's published and updated every year in a proprietary format of XML. So it's a complete headache to work with. I wouldn't wish that upon anyone. But we are lucky in the Elixir ecosystem that we have a gentleman named Kip Cole who has done a lot of that for us and put in a lot of hard work to create packages on top of this data set. What the data set looks like, if we just look at GitHub quickly, because they publish this all and it's public and you can download it to your machine. So they have the CLDR repo, but recently they've also started publishing a version in JSON that's maybe a bit easier to work with. So the CLDR JSON repo is over here. And if you click through it, it's just a bunch of JSON files. There are thousands upon thousands of JSON files, and it's organized into different features. So a feature might be calendars, or it might be language names, or it might be, like here's an Ethiopic calendar, a Hebrew calendar, all sorts of things like that. There's some core thing, I'm not sure what's in there. We can look at dates, for example, and dig a bit deeper. And here you'll see a bunch of stuff that's now organized by locale. So each of these is a typical particular language in a particular country. I'm going to click on one completely randomly, AF, because it happens to be my mother language, Afrikaans, and then see if we can get anything interesting in here. So time zone names. Okay, so this is just a JSON file, and you can see that it's structured in some way. There's like this AF key, which is the locale, and the language is Afrikaans. And then it gives you different formats for working with time zones, for example. And here is one example where something would be formatted as some placeholder and then daglichttijd. So that would be daylight time. And then some placeholder and standaardtijd, and that would be standard time. Now, for each locale, there's a file like this that tells the language of how, that gives you the rule of how that particular thing works. And there are like thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these kind of things. So it's completely boring to work with, but it's structured, which means we can build really interesting applications out of it. So what that looks like in Elixir is the XCLDR suite of libraries. I'm saying suite of libraries because it's not just one. And that's where many people get tripped up. You want to get into this, and it's not just one thing like gettext where it's one README and there you go. Unfortunately, it looks like this. It's about 21 odd libraries together. And now you don't need all of them, but there are lots of entry points and it can be confusing. So that's really the purpose behind this talk, is to try and give you a bit more context so you know where to dig. And then in the same breath, I just want to notice that I'm working on a book together with Kip Cole, the author of the packages, to also just do the same thing, just distill a bit of this and give you a single entry point that gives you an overview of what's possible with this suite of libraries. So the interesting ones here that I want to talk about is the base one. The base one just lets you basically configure your application, say which locales do you want to switch on, which features are you interested in. You don't want all of them. It's a massive compile time trade-off. So you really just want to pick the ones you need. Then there's XCLDR trans, which you use for the database records. There's XCLDR plugs that I'm not going to talk about here, but I will in the book. That's just for reading the locale, storing it to the session, keeping track of it. It helps you to propagate that across processes, that kind of thing. XCLDR numbers, I'll show you a little bit about. XCLDR units is useful for areas and volumes and all kinds of things like that. And then date times, calendars, all sorts of things. So there's a lot there, there's a lot going on, and it's difficult to know what's possible if you haven't kind of dug through it. But yeah, so to give you an example of XCLDR numbers, you might see this kind of thing somewhere in an admin dashboard to try and keep track of how many visitors you have on some service. And this is terrible. It's really bad. If you use XCLDR numbers to format those numbers, that's all you're doing, nothing else. Immediately, you get much better user experience. It's much easier to scan that and read that, oh, that is 100,000 visitors. It's not 1 million, it's not 10,000. It's definitely 100,000. This is what XCLDR numbers can do for you. And it's basically just one function you need to call each time. You tell it it's formatting a number, and you want to print that number. Please format it in a proper way for me. Now, once you've done that, you get some benefit that you can then go and configure locales. So the same logic that you wrote to make sense of that number in English can now, at the flick of a switch, also make that number sensible in Spanish, or in Hindi, or in Indonesian. And I don't speak any of these languages, but I can format a number properly in these languages. Some quirks to look at here, for example, is in Hindi. Not only do you have to have the correct delimiter for the numbers, you have to put them in the right place. So they have delimiters like after 3 and then each 2 subsequent characters. And that's because of a historical quirk, they've got a word in most of the languages in that region for 10,000, and they've got a different word for 10 million. Sorry, 100,000 and 10 million. So it's, I think, of the luck and the crora, and they would speak of luck and crora in their verbal communication, and then that filters through into how you work with it on a computer as well. So, yes. So another quirk to notice here is, for example, at the top, the words US would precede the $sign in countries where it might be ambiguous if you just have a $sign. And sometimes that symbol would be expected after the value. Sometimes it would be expected before the value. Now, with XCLDR numbers, it knows about all that, all of those things, because it's got this rich, structured data set underneath it. What's even cooler is if you can work with currency values in that way. In order to do this formatting properly, it needs to know a lot of things about countries and currencies and numbers. Now it knows all of those things, so it's pretty short hop then to a package called xmoney by the same author that also uses this as a dependency that goes further and lets you convert between currencies. It lets you track exchange rates from different APIs and things like that. All of that's possible because of the structured approach. In that same package, you can go and create your own currencies and track your own exchange rates over time. And you don't have to roll it yourself. You don't have to make all the mistakes you would make in currency handling if you just go at it in a naive way. So that's really the benefit of these kind of packages. It gives you this structured approach you can rely on to add new things. It's true for money values. It's true for calendars. It's true for units of measure and things like that. So if you have any of those kinds of problems in your code, it can actually clean up some of your application logic for you. So let me show you what that looks like in code. And then firstly, I think I should just give a quick shout out to Jonathan Klosko, who has done an excellent job on Livebook. It certainly made me much more productive. I know he's not here at the conference, but I just really appreciate the work. I'm saying thank you to him because I really appreciate him, but I also want to distract you from the fact that the setup is taking, it took almost 20 minutes to run. And that's where I'm talking about the compile time trade-offs. So here we've got 4 libraries, the base one, numbers, dates times, and the translation library. And we've got 4 locales. And that costs us about 20 seconds in compile time. Now, you don't have to do this in dev all the time. In dev, you would typically just have your en locale activated, just to keep the compile time trade-off as small as possible. But then for production, it does cost you something. And how it works is you define a backend. So it's similar to how gettext would work, in terms of you have a backend, and then at compile time, a bunch of localization functions are compiled into that backend. And I'm talking of thousands upon thousands. So for number handling, it looks like this. You have a number, it's 1 million. We want to format this number in the States. Here I'm explicitly passing in the locale, but you don't have to. Normally, for a web request in Phoenix, that would be set up once for the process, and then everything just works. So you format this number, you want to push it to string, and it puts the commas in the right place. And that's fantastic. Now you go to Brazil, and it's the same number. Now again, in a web process, the locale would be configured somewhere else, and it would be exactly the same function call. There wouldn't be any if statements or anything like that, and you'll see that it's got the right delimiter suddenly. And now the same thing if you go to India. It's got the right delimiter, and it puts them in the right place again, as I told you about with the luck and the crawler. So that's just basic number handling. And number handling, because it has the structured approach, it can also convert between different number systems. So you have this number 123, and you need that in Roman numerals. You can do that. You can't do it for very large numbers because Roman numerals break for anything over about 5,000, I think. But here you can convert it to Thai numerals, and it'll even give you a warning when you're doing this at runtime when it should be happening at compile time. You can go and look at Arab numerals or Devanagari script, which is used in India in like traditional contexts and things. So there's the Arab numerals and the Devanagari script. And the same kind of thing can even let you spell out numbers. So the way you do it if you write a number on a checkbook. And you can do that not just in English, but in any of these languages. It's fantastic. So if you don't have that problem, of course, it's not relevant, but for these types of problems, when you do run into them, it's fantastically useful. Here again is a money example. So formatting USD in the States is easy, and then when you move elsewhere, like Brazil, they would expect a space in between the symbol and the number. And in Germany, they would expect the symbol on the other side again. So luckily, CLDR numbers is smart enough to know about this. I'm not going to show you any of the X-money stuff, but I've told you already that it's a short hop from there to start doing interesting things like currency conversions and so on. So for dates and times, it's similar. So here's a date in English, and it's a long format in the States. But we can also do that in India and in Germany, and it would look like this. And we don't have to do any other logic. It just works. There's a short format that looks like this. And you'll see that, for example, it's day, or it's month, day in the States, but it's day, month, year, everywhere else. And it's smart enough to know about that. If you don't pass in any format, it'll default to, I think, this. So this kind of thing can be very useful as well. This one I found quite cool. So if you have some kind of interface where you're displaying events that have happened recently, or you're sending someone a notification to say, listen, your Uber is 5 minutes away, or whatever that might be, you can actually automate that. But not just in English, you can automate that in whichever language is supported by the CLDR, and there are many of them. So this would be 3 seconds ago. We could say something that literally happened 0 seconds ago, or something that's happening in 30 seconds, or 300, or 3 with lots of zeros. Yeah. So this kind of thing, I have in the past been guilty of writing a case statement for exactly this problem where I was trying to format it, and it was only working for English, and it had lots of edge cases where it would break. With this, it's one thing, and it works, and you can trust it, and you can do it in any locale that's necessary. Calendars are fantastically useful as well. So here you've got today's date, and we can have a look at what quarter today's date falls into. So it gives us a range. You can loop over that range to get all the days. But what's interesting about this is you can use it for forming queries on your database to say, for example, how does this quarter compare to previous quarter, something like that. But that's the quarter in the calendar year. What if we convert it to the fiscal year? Then it's a different quarter. Now here it's giving us a date on the fiscal year's calendar. So the 10th month of the calendar year, it's not October, it's the 10th month of the fiscal year of the US. So it's just a completely different calendar, and that date timestamp can exist on both of them. You can convert between them. Here we're converting to the National Retail Federation of Foundations calendar. So they use that for lots of reporting and stuff. And you can see how these things can be really useful if you need to do some complicated reporting. Here you can take the current quarter on the fiscal year, and we can say what's the first day. We can say what's the last day. Now again, that you could use in a Postgres query, for example, to do some really cool stuff. And you can step through it. You can say, okay, what's the previous quarter? So we know what today's quarter is falling in, but what's the previous one and the next one, so we can do comparisons. Here we can say, okay, we've got a different fiscal year in Japan and in the States. So today's date would localize to Q4 in the US if all of this is working correctly, but it's actually Q2 in Japan. So if you have a transaction, it might span the continent, it might span a few continents, suppliers in Japan, customers in the US, and you can do all sorts of interesting stuff where you can know where this date stamp falls into for both of those. So for me, I found that quite interesting. The translation stuff is also actually pretty simple. You have a regular struct. You define your struct. It might have a lot of fields. Here I only have 2. But then you tell the translation package which fields you want to translate. You're not interested in translating all of them. So it would only be a title or a description here, for example. And then you define your schema as you normally would, but you add this translations field at the end. And that's a macro that goes and it creates whatever you need to have a structured JSON field that just handles the translations for you on the record. Now, what's nice is it on the database even, it handles it on the same row of the database. So you don't have any extra joins that you have to care about. It just works. What it looks like if you've queried it then is something like this, where you still have your normal struct. It has its normal fields, but it has this added translations field. And you don't have to work with the translations field directly, but what's interesting to know here just is that it's structured. There's a struct underneath that, which contains an entry for each locale that you've got configured. And each entry for each locale is also structured. It's got an entry for each field that you've got configured. And now I'm saying you wouldn't need to work with this directly, because all you do is translate the whole thing in one go. So if we inspect this once, the product title is that, and the product description is that. But if we take the whole struct and we ask CLDR trans to just translate that whole thing to Portuguese for us, and we run it again, then you get that. So you can still work with the same struct in the same way. You just translate it to the user who's looking at it. And the rest of the information is still there, which I found pretty fantastic. Cool. So those are the livebook examples. What else is there? There's the CLDR plugs that I'm not talking about now, but it just makes it easy in a web context to figure out what is the locale of the user and to have some strategy about how do you persist that and how do you propagate that across processes so that you can configure each process. There's CLDR routes, which you use if you need to do SEO. So you might have specific routes that contain keywords in English for a specific endpoint, but now you want to do that in Hindi as well, or in German, or whatever. Then you can do that with CLDR routes, and it lets you do both. You can do the English routes and the other language routes in one code base. There's CLDR units, which lets you work with feet and inches and all sorts of things like that. But because it's got this structured approach, it lets you define your own units if you need to, and it lets you convert between units. So if you're doing a big e-commerce company and you've got some boxes measured in inches, you've got some boxes measured in millimeters, you can still query it to tell me what kind of volume did I ship. And that's pretty cool. And then right-to-left support. So the CLDR libraries aren't going to lay out your app for you, but it does contain flags to say, okay, this locale actually expects right-to-left, whereas the other locale doesn't. And then with the modern CSS stuff, with Tailwind and so on, it's actually quite easy to do a right-to-left interface and have it configurable. So yes, that's my talk. I'm Petrus, and you can reach me via email. If you are interested in this kind of stuff, I am working on this book with Kip Cole. It's about halfway done. I have a few copies that I would love to give you if you're interested, and if you can give me some feedback on that, I would love it as well, obviously.